Introduction: The Ghost of the North. Welcome to Synapse Daily. Today, we step into a frozen nightmare. A city where the ground is permanent ice. A place where the sky is often black from smoke. In our last journey, we explored Zeleznogorsk. We saw a city hidden inside a mountain. But today, we look at a city that cannot be hidden. It is too big. It is too loud. It is too toxic. Welcome to Norilsk, 1971. This was the year of the Great Expansion. The Soviet Union decided to conquer the Arctic. They wanted the riches buried in the frost. They didn't care about the cost in human life. This is the story of how they built a masterpiece in hell. Chapter 1: The Kremlin's Hunger for Nickel. The year is 1971. The Cold War is at a peak. The Soviet Union is building thousands of tanks. They are building rockets to reach the stars. To do this, they need one thing: metal. Specifically, they need nickel, copper, and palladium. Without these, the Soviet military machine stops. In the 1960s, Soviet geologists found a treasure. They discovered the Talnak ore deposit near Norilsk. It was the richest mineral find in human history. The ore was incredibly pure. But there was a problem. The treasure was locked under 1,500 meters of ice. The Kremlin gave a simple order in 1971. Expand Norilsk. Double the production. Now. Money was no object. The plan was absolute. Norilsk was no longer just a mining camp. It was becoming the industrial heart of the USSR. If Norilsk breathed, the Soviet Union grew. If Norilsk stopped, the empire would starve. Chapter 2: Conquering the Permafrost, the Stilt Secret. How do you build a city on a giant ice cube? This was the engineering challenge of 1971. The ground in Norilsk is permafrost. It is soil and ice frozen for thousands of years. If you build a normal house, the heat melts the ice. The ground turns to mud. The building sinks. The Soviet engineers in 1971 used a brutal solution. They used high-pressure steam to melt deep holes. They drove massive concrete piles 30 meters deep. These piles reached the solid rock beneath the ice. Then, they left a gap under the building. This allowed the freezing wind to blow under the floor. It kept the ground frozen. It kept the building stable. Walking through Norilsk in 1971 was strange. Every building looked like it was standing on legs. It was a city of stilts. It was a city that refused to touch the earth. One mistake in the math meant a collapsed tower. The engineers worked under extreme pressure. Failure was not an option in the Arctic. Chapter 3: The Fortress of Concrete, Urban Defense. The wind in Norilsk is a killer. It is called the porga. It can blow a person off their feet in seconds. In 1971, architects designed a new kind of city. They built the closed-contour micro-districts. They arranged massive apartment blocks in giant circles. These buildings acted as a shield. Outside the circle, the wind was 100 kilometers per hour. Inside the courtyard, it was calm. Children could play. People could walk. The buildings were painted in bright reds and yellows. Why? Because the world outside was only gray. Gray smoke. Gray snow. Gray sky. The 1971 expansion was a psychological war. They wanted the workers to feel they were in a fortress. A socialist utopia protected from the wild tundra. But inside the fortress, the air was thick with sulfur. The walls protected them from the wind. But they could not protect them from the factory. Chapter 4: Survival in the 45-day night. Imagine the sun disappears. In Norilsk, the polar night begins in November. It stays dark for 45 days straight. In 1971, thousands of new workers arrived from the south. They were not ready for the darkness. The human brain needs light to stay sane. Without light, people become depressed and violent. The Soviet state had to find a solution. They built winter gardens inside the factories. They planted tropical palms in the middle of the Arctic. They gave workers ultraviolet light baths. Miners would stand in a circle, wearing only goggles. A giant lamp would simulate the sun for 10 minutes. It was artificial life. The 1971 expansion created a synthetic lifestyle. Everything was fake. Fake sun. Fake warmth. Fake colors. But the money was real. A miner in Norilsk earned more than a doctor in Moscow. They stayed for the money. They stayed for the polar bonus. But they paid for it with their health. In the dark of 1971, the city hummed with machines. The people lived like ghosts in a neon-lit cage. Chapter 5, The Underground Labyrinth, The Deep Heat. The 1971 expansion went deep. Really deep. The miners entered the Oktyabrski shaft. It was a hole into another world. The depth was over 1,200 meters. On the surface, it was minus 50 degrees Celsius. But deep underground, it was different. The earth is warm inside. The friction of massive drills creates heat. Down there, it was plus 30 degrees Celsius. Miners worked in t-shirts and shorts. Sweat dripped onto the frozen nickel ore. Then came the most dangerous part. The ascent. They had to leave the heat. They stepped into the Arctic air. An 80-degree temperature shock in seconds. The lungs cannot handle this easily. Many miners developed Arctic asthma. Their breath froze inside their chests. But the machines never stopped. The 1,971 drills were monsters. They chewed through granite all night. The city above lived on this vibration. It was a heartbeat of steel. Chapter 6, The Red River and Acid Skies. Success in 1971 had a color. That color was dark gray. The expansion built more smelting furnaces. They burned ore at incredible temperatures. The chimneys released a toxic ghost. Sulfur dioxide filled the Arctic sky. When it rained, the rain was acid. The snow didn't sparkle. It turned black within minutes. Look at the Daldikan River. In 1971, it changed forever. Chemical runoff turned the water bright red. It looked like a river of blood. The fish died instantly. The reindeer refused to drink. Around the city, the forest died. 30 miles of dead, white trees. They are called skeleton forests. The workers saw this every day. They knew the air was poison. But they were told it was progress. The smoke is our pride, they said. In Norilsk, oxygen was a luxury. Chapter 7, The Golden Cage and KGB Eyes. Norilsk in 1971 was a secret. It was a closed city. You needed a special internal passport. No foreigners were allowed near the nickel. The KGB watched every street corner. They listened to every phone call. But there was a golden side. The workers were the Soviet elite. In Moscow, shops were often empty. In Norilsk, the shops were full. They had Hungarian ham. They had French perfumes. They had the best Russian caviar. The state gave them polar bonuses. They earned more than army generals. But they could not leave. You were a prisoner of your own wealth. The KGB made sure of that. If you talked about the Red River, the KGB visited you. If you talked about the mining accidents, your golden life ended. It was a city of silence and luxury. Chapter 8, The Transport Nightmare, The Only Way Out. How do you supply a city of 200,000? Norilsk has no roads to Russia. None. In 1971, the isolation was absolute. Everything came by ship or plane. The port of Dudinka was the gateway. It sat on the Yenisei River. But the river freezes solid. The Soviets used massive nuclear icebreakers. They smashed the ice to bring food. They smashed the ice to take nickel. Planes landed in blinding snowstorms. The pilots were the bravest in the world. If the plane stopped, the city starved. There was a railway, but it led nowhere. It was a ghost track in the tundra. In 1971, the air bridge was vital. Cargo planes flew 24 hours a day. They brought milk. They brought bricks. They brought the people for the expansion. Every flight was a gamble with the wind. Every ship was a fight with the ice. Norilsk was an island on land. Chapter 9, The Titans of 1971, The Iron Giants. The expansion required massive power. In 1971, the Soviets brought in Titans. They used the BelAZ dump trucks. These were moving houses of steel. Their tires were taller than a man. They carried 40 tons of frozen ore. The engines roared through the polar night. The noise was deafening. But the trucks never stopped. If an engine stopped, it froze forever. The mechanics worked in the open wind. They touched cold steel with bare hands. Their skin stayed on the metal. In 1971, they also built the smelters. The Nadezhda plant was a monster. It used flash smelting technology. This was cutting edge for the era. It turned raw rock into liquid fire. The heat was 1,500 degrees Celsius. Inside the plant, it was summer. Outside, it was the death of heat. The machines and the men became one. They were the gears of a hungry empire. Chapter 10, Health and the Nickel Lungs. What happens to a body in Norilsk? In 1971, the state kept secrets. They didn't talk about the nickel lungs. Every breath contained heavy metal dust. Nickel. Copper. Cobalt. The particles are tiny. They enter the bloodstream instantly. The life expectancy was 10 years shorter. In 1971, workers suffered from chronic bronchitis. But the doctors had a different name. They called it the Norilsk cough. It was the sound of the city. Cancer rates were higher here. Skin diseases were common. The sulfur in the air burned eyes. But there were no protests. The state gave them free milk. They gave them sanatorium vacations. They told them the air was heroic. Human biology was losing the war. But the nickel output was winning. The factory was healthy. The people were not. Chapter 11, The Women of the Frozen City. Norilsk was not just for men. In 1971, women were the backbone. They were the doctors in the clinics. They were the chemists in the labs. They tested the purity of the palladium. Without them, the science would fail. They also managed the winter gardens. They kept the palm trees alive. They created a home in the tundra. Imagine a woman in a fur coat. She walks through a -50 degrees Celsius blizzard. She enters a school. She teaches children about the sun. Children who haven't seen it for weeks. Women in Norilsk were incredibly tough. They raised families in a toxic desert. They cooked with water from melted snow. They made the closed city feel real. They were the silent pillars of 1971. If the men were the hammers, the women were the glue. Chapter 12, The Thaw of the Century, The Sinking City. Let's jump to the present day. The 1971 expansion is in trouble. The permafrost is not permanent anymore. The climate is changing. The Arctic is warming twice as fast. The ice inside the ground is melting. The stilts from 1971 are shifting. Giant apartment blocks are splitting open. The closed contour walls are cracking. In 2020, a fuel tank collapsed. 21,000 tons of diesel spilled. The rivers turned red again. Why? Because the ground gave way. The engineering of 1971 assumed one thing: the ice would never melt. They were wrong. The city is slowly sinking into the mud. The frozen furnace is losing its foundation. Nature is taking back the land. One crack at a time. Chapter 13, The Final Legacy, Ambition versus Nature. What is the lesson of Norilsk? In 1971, it was a symbol of power. It showed that man could conquer anything. We could build cities on ice. We could breathe sulfur and survive. But Norilsk is also a warning. It shows the price of raw ambition. The city is still the richest in Russia. It is still the most polluted. It is a place of extreme beauty and horror. The people are proud. The history is dark. The future is uncertain. In the 1971 expansion, the USSR built a secret. Today, that secret is a global scar. It remains the coldest, darkest, richest ghost. A city that refuses to die. A city that should not be. Conclusion, Synapse Daily farewell. Norilsk 1971. A monument to the Soviet dream. A nightmare for the Arctic tundra. Thank you for staying with us. This journey into the north is over. But the stories of human ambition never end. If you enjoyed this deep dive, look back. Check our video on Zeleznogorsk. Compare the underground silence with the Norilsk smoke. The Cold War was built on these cities. Like this video if you learned something new. Comment your thoughts below. Could you live in the dark? Subscribe to Synapse Daily for more fascinating stories. See you in the next episode.